I want to talk in this session about preaching through tough text on sensitive topics. There's a famous statement that is attributed to Martin Luther. It actually is probably not from him originally, but it goes like this, that the courage of a soldier is tested not by how bravely he stands where the battle is not being fought. The courage of the soldier is demonstrated by how he stands at the place where the battle is the fiercest. What that means is that our courage is not demonstrated by how boldly we preach things that are not controversial anymore. How profoundly we stand on things that we're not going to get a lot of pushback on. Where our courage is tested, where we demonstrate it, is when we're willing to preach on things that are countercultural and things that are controversial. My favorite analogy for preaching comes from an old book that John Stott wrote, old book called The Preacher's Portrait. And in that, he explores several words that describe the preacher, but one of them is the word steward. Stewards. Paul says that preachers are stewards of the mysteries, the words of God. And he points out that a steward in those days was basically like a household servant. A servant who essentially ran the house. A servant who in many cases for a rich person would take the responsibility to rear the children and feed the children. Dr. Stott says that when the steward would go to the pantry to put together the meal for the children, the steward was not choosing what went into the pantry. That was a parent's decision, what the kids were going to eat. But then the steward would take those ingredients that the parent had purchased and he would arrange them into a meal that the children would benefit from. John Stott said that's what a preacher is doing. We're going to the pantry, so to speak, of what God has put in his word, what he intends for his children to benefit from, and then that steward arranges those ingredients into a form that he can preach to God's people. That's what we are doing as pastors. I'm not responsible for the content of what's in the pantry. That God chose that. What I need to do is, sometimes I'll put it into different series and I'll go from different parts of the Bible, but my job is to preach the full counsel of God and let God choose the food and let God set the agenda. That's one of the reasons that expository preaching is so important, why it ought to be not just one style among many, but ought to be the bread and butter, so to speak, of every pastor, because that's where you make sure that you are preaching God's agenda and not your own, where you're keeping his priorities in front of the church and not things that are just of interest to you or that even flow out of your giftedness. You want it to be God choosing what his children read and feast upon. And if you do that, that'll make sure that you are covering the countercultural things, the controversial and the sensitive things in the right way and to the right proportions. You see, the Bible is countercultural in every generation. In different ways. In our day, it's countercultural when it comes to things like sex and those kinds of moral principles. It's also countercultural when it comes to our responsibility to God and Jesus' lordship over our bodies. For Muslims, when I served as a missionary there, it was countercultural in an entirely different way. They had really had no problem with God's authority in sex and his design, but you started to talk about grace and God's grace toward the adulterer. That they just thought that was scandalous. Like you can't say that because that will undo the very fabric of society. We look at things that would have been controversial in other days and we think, well, that's not controversial in my day. I want to make sure that I'm being faithful to preach what God says, even when it goes against what my generation thinks is right, and even when it's countercultural. And preaching expositionally will help keep you balanced. I hope that if I were a pastor preaching in Charleston, South Carolina in 1861, that I would talk about the evils of racism. Well, in the same way, I need today to talk about the sinfulness of things like homosexuality and how heartbreaking it is to God and how wicked it is when somebody kills a baby in the name of choice. Preaching expositionally will keep you from sounding like a culture warrior. It'll keep you balanced. It'll keep you talking about things really in the proportions that God intends you to talk about them. Now, another dimension that we as pastors have to think through when we're preaching on sensitive topics and countercultural topics is our calling to be missionaries and defenders of orthodoxy at the same time. I actually get those two terms from a guy named Michael Green, who wrote a book called Evangelism in the First Century, and he talks about how in the early church there were both missionaries and defenders of orthodoxy. He said, a defender of orthodoxy's burden is to show how distinct, how countercultural what the gospel's message is to whatever the culture teaches. The missionary's burden, he says, is to bridge the gap between the church and the world and to try to show that the questions that the culture is asking are the same ones the gospel is giving a better answer to. He said, when you look at that one is trying to show the gap and the other is trying to bridge the gap, he said, you realize they're kind of pulling in two different directions. He said, but in a healthy church, they will never contradict. They need each other. They're both part of the Christian witness. But he said they're not exactly the same, and you have to have respect for both of them and realize they're both part of a healthy church. Defenders of orthodoxy and missionary ought to always be in fellowship and in dialogue. Well, see, a pastor has to play the role of both. I am a shepherd to my church, means I'm a defender of orthodoxy. I've got to keep them from error. But every week when I preach, I'm also a missionary to those outside the church in my community. And so I have to balance both of them. As I said, I hope that if I were preaching in Charleston, South Carolina in 1861, I'd have the courage to preach about equality and dignity, even though it was countercultural and even though that put me at odds with people in the culture. God has put us here to be salt and light. He's put us here to rebuke the works of darkness. I am a missionary. I'm an advocate. I'm trying to reach out, but I'm doing so with boldness. John the Baptist looked at Herod and said, it's not right. What you're doing sexually and having your brother's wife is not right. Jesus did not chide him for saying, you insensitive guy, you shouldn't have brought that up. That was controversial. You should have stuck to the main thing. No, Jesus said John the Baptist was the greatest prophet ever to live. He commended how he preached against sexual sin in his day, even though it literally cost John the Baptist his head. In Revelation 2, Jesus warns about removing the lampstand of his presence from a church who is exemplary in every way. They were just unfaithful in how they talked about sexual sin. And you can be basically perfect in everything else, but if you don't have courage on this, then it removes the presence of Jesus for you. I've got to be a defender of orthodoxy, but I've also got to be a missionary, which means that I want my life to be characterized by what Jesus was characterized, which is not by how he pushed people away, but how he brought them close. But I hope in my preaching I have in mind the gay person, not the gay caucus, but the individual who is there, who's confused, who's hurting, who, yes, needs to be rebuked for sin and rebellion to God, but who's bringing in a story. I hope I have in mind the woman who has just gotten an abortion, who is devastated by it, is not sure what that means about her and her future. I hope my message sounds more like something I would say if I were talking with her over coffee than it would be if I were trying to make an appearance on Fox News or CNN and make a culture war statement. And I'm going to tell you, if you preach that way, if you preach like a missionary, that's not going to make the people in your church who want you to do more culture war, it's not going to make them happy. But Jesus was different, and Jesus sometimes alienated the people who he doctrinally agreed with because he put such an emphasis on grace. Yes, he told them the truth, like John the Baptist did. But what stood out is how he drew people close and how sinners, even as he was convicting them of their sin, they just sensed this grace that was coming off of him, of how he understood and how he entered into their pain. And he came not to condemn, but to save. We got to pursue the right balance is what I'm saying. D.A. Carson says that some heresy is just truth out of proportion. It means you're not wrong on what you say, you're wrong in the emphasis that you give it. I sometimes wonder if we will err on not what we say, but how we talk about these things. If you're going to err, I would just say err on the side of grace. I don't ever mean compromising, but Jesus was described as being full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. Truth without grace is judgmental fundamentalism, but grace without truth is just vapid sentimentality. Grace and truth, but notice that grace in the description of Jesus comes before truth. Understand that kind of word order in the Bible is never accidental. Jesus led with grace. Let me offer two final thoughts on this that I found helpful in the years that I've tried to be faithful to preach on sensitive topics. We have a rule on our preaching team, and that is no drive-bys. If you're going to talk about something sensitive or controversial, don't mention it in a list. Don't lob out something. Certainly don't say something sarcastic or demeaning and just move on. We call that a drive-by. If I'm going to talk about homosexuality, if I'm going to talk about abortion, if I'm going to talk about nationalism or militarism or whatever you want to put in that category, or racism, I'm going to stop and I'm going to make sure that I take time to unpack what I mean, what I don't mean, to make sure that I'm addressing the individuals. And because the more you retreat to drive-bys, it'll make your it'll make the choir happy. You can preach to the choir, but you'll be alienating people who are really confused as to what you mean by it. We all the time will hear how the gay community feels alienated from the church. Some of that is because of what we believe, and we've got to be faithful to it. But some of it is because we haven't talked about these kinds of sins in a way that Jesus would have talked about them, in a way that was full, that exuded grace and truth at the same time. So that's the first one. Don't do drive-bys. Don't do culture war kind of stuff. The second one is, I would encourage you to tell people on some of these things, especially if they're unbelievers or they're in the process of searching. Tell them it's okay to punt on some of these issues. That's something I actually borrowed from C.S. Lewis in his chapter on sex and mere Christianity. After laying out, as C.S. Lewis does, a brilliant chapter on why the Bible's teaching on sex is the right teaching, he kind of recognizes that a lot of people that are reading that are going to be like, this feels so backwards. He says, hey, if this just totally messed you up, he says, it's okay to punt for a while, because the center of Christianity is not a particular view of sexuality. It's important, but that's not the center. He says the center of Christianity is Christ, is the lordship of Christ. He says, I'm not saying that other stuff's not important, but let's go back to the center, which is who Jesus is and if he's Lord. Because if he is who he says he is and he's Lord, then let's start there and let's let him work with you on those other issues that you're having trouble with. So let's not talk about those before we talk about the lordship of Christ. So I tell people sometimes after I'll take time to explain it and say, hey, if you're in the process of learning who Jesus is, if you're trying to figure this out and what I said just totally messed you up, it's okay, just punt this for a while. And let's go back to the center of Christianity, which is the lordship of Christ. And let's talk about that. And once we talk about that, then when you trust him, you'll have his Holy Spirit who will help you on those other areas. So that's where I'd want to end in talking about sensitive topics, is I want to keep the focus on Christ, because ultimately faithfulness to Christ, not just the morals that he teaches, but the spirit that he lived with. That is what it means to preach in a gospel-centered way when it comes to sensitive and controversial topics.